Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Creating a Whole Farm or Grazing Plan, Who, What, When, Why, and How. My name is Pete Huff. I'm a program officer with the Pasture Project, which is part of our Wallace Center at Winrock International. A quick note on some upcoming Pasture Project webinars. On July 10th, we have Establishing Optimal Forage Chains for Rotational Grazing. On the 18th, we have a webinar on contract cattle grazing and establishing grazing leases. The 23rd of July is a grazing cover crops webinar focusing on planning and infrastructure. And on July 30th, there is a webinar on the financial aspects of grazing cover crops. So these are all grazing related. They kind of work together to continuously build knowledge. And all webinars are from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Central Time. And if you want to join these, make sure that you register, and you can do that at pastureproject.org/events. The Pasture Project is an initiative of the Wallace Center, and we work to advance and integrate regenerative grazing as a scalable, market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities in the upper Midwest. And we work within largely within a 6-state region within the upper Midwest, specifically the upper Mississippi River Basin. We do this through a lot of different approaches. Working on a regional level, we try to collect the data and do some field testing to build the case for regenerative grazing, both the economic and the environmental case for grazing. We try to build resources that help folks with their planning and changing their management practices. We also work with a lot of different individuals, organizations, and networks that are supporting regenerative grazing in the different states that we work in, as well as nationally. And ultimately, we look for ways that we can free up some of the bottlenecks, both political, financial, and other areas that support or sometimes limit grazing in different areas. There's a lot of different things that we do. This is just a quick summary to tell you a little bit about who we are, and you can find out more at pastureproject.org. You can also contact us with the information at the end. If you want to know a little bit more about what we do, I'll be more than happy to chat with you via email or phone. I want to introduce our presenters for tonight. The first presenter that we'll hear from is Rod Ofte. He's the owner of Willow Creek Ranch and a core team member of the Pasture Project. He leads the Pasture Project work in the Kickapoo watershed, and as I mentioned, is a member of our core team. He's a fourth-generation farmer that operates a rotational grazing beef operation near Coon Valley, Wisconsin. He attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and served on deployments in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. He has his MBA from Boston University and over 25 years of experience in the food industry, including time working in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. He's currently the president of Norris Group Consulting, and he markets his finished cattle directly to consumers via the Wisconsin Grass-Fed Beef Cooperative. Rod, when he's not doing those other things, is a fisherman, hunter, and dad to 2 girls. We're also fortunate to be joined by John Zinn, who's serving currently in one of many capacities as a grazing specialist for us here at the Pasture Project. John has been working as either a livestock producer or with livestock producers for over 40 years. He currently is helping us, as I mentioned, in his grazing specialist position with the Pasture Project, specifically working in Vernon County, Wisconsin. From 2007 to 2016, he was a state grazing specialist for the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Minnesota.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks again for attending. Pretty interesting subject, whole farm planning. We're going to do a bit of the how, what, whys, when, where, and who, the real basics. Getting into things, it looks like we've got a lot of different backgrounds, but that's fine because whole farm planning is a hot topic. It's in the news. You probably all have heard about it, and maybe that's why you've joined us. You're very curious. But a whole farm plan is really applicable to all stages of farming, from beginning to really have a solid plan going into farming, and even now it's being used as a generational transition to really do an assets assessment and then understand leadership and transition of ownership. So it's very very relevant for all of you attending. It's also been called holistic farm planning, holistic management. Maybe some of you have heard from about Alan Savory, Joel Salatin, those guys using the same principles. And what it really is in a nutshell is it's simply a complete resource inventory and assessment of what you have available to you. It sounds overly simple, but really until you start asking these hard questions, do you really know what you have available? And we've done a number of these at the Pasture Project, and I'm always shocked, as are the folks we interview. Some of them have been on the same farm for 4 or 5 generations, and they still are still not aware of all the assets they have available. So in a nutshell, This interconnects different steps to improve your farm profitability and sustainability. An environmentally sustainable farm is going to be an economically sustainable farm, and that's the goal. And it works on the theory that all actions and decisions have natural counteractions. Now, I think it's human nature to say, okay, I want to be a farmer, I want to plant corn. And so you think, okay, what do I have to do to plant corn? And so I'm going to till the soil. Well, that action of tilling the soil has a lot of ramifications. So you're exposing the soil. The soil may run off. You may lose organic matter. If it runs into the stream, you may pollute the water. If you over-fertilize, you may pollute the water. And these are all to understand every action is a counteraction, and that when we decide on an action, we actually embed all those counteractions also into our plan and our outcome. Okay. So what is a whole farm plan? Quite a bit of history here. And as you can see, over the last few decades, it's really developed and been built up on soil planning. And though we've been farmers for millennia, it's really back in the last couple of centuries that we really began to understand as farmers, landowners, and producers that almost everything dwells on our soil. If we've got great soil, we're going to have a productive farm. And then we're starting to understand more and more those microorganisms that really run our farm and make it work, and how and why. And hence it's developed from just basic soil con to nutrient management and then environmental management, and then that leading to whole farm plans. One of the other neat topics that I said the whole farm planning is also leading to is helping next generation farmers make that transition, which is also a very emotional and challenging subject. So why is the Pasture Project interested in whole farm planning if Alan Savory's doing it and Joel Salatin? Well, we found it's very important. We wanted to have a way to reach out to producers and landowners and give them really good, sound advice. Unfortunately, it sounds like that's available everywhere, but if you think of it, almost every person that drives down a farmer's driveway is trying to sell them something. You can't go to a trade show or even a Moses Organic Conference, and there's literally hundreds and hundreds of products that you walk through that you'll leave thinking, I can't farm without 99% of this stuff. Well, in fact, probably 99% of it you don't need. So our approach was to fund it so there's no cost, and make sure that everyone understands that there is a counteraction to their decisions, but also to provide neutral advice and do a lot of listening. Also, by having someone else that's, they're not trying to sell you something, the farmer can open up and share the resources that they have available and just kind of talk out loud and visit on the farm. And often a third party that's neutral to your farm can see things that farmer cannot see. So what was our experiment? So we hired a man named Ted Bay, and Ted's still with our team, and Ted had a perfect background for what we wanted to do because he was first of all and foremost a farmer himself. So he'd walked the soil, walked in the shoes, and he knew the talk, and in many cases he knew the farmer. So that was just a great experience builder. Secondly, he had worked for NRCS, so a ton of background. Our approach to getting landowners and producers open to the concept was we would have a number of field events, educational events, outreach events, and at registration we would simply say to people, hey, are you open to us following up with you if there's some things you'd like to learn more about? Only folks that said, yes, I'd like to hear from you, I'd like these ideas, I'd like to know more about topic A, B, or C, would we follow up. And then we would also, most importantly, when we get to this initial interview, always keep the landowner, producer, their interest top of mind. And when you look somebody in the eye, it's obvious you're not trying to sell something, and say, what are your goals? How can we help you achieve them? People are much more likely to be open, and we've had great success with that. So I'm going to get into the whole farm planning worksheet that we used. It was built off an NRCS template. This is also there as an attachment for you all to download. I would highly encourage that. Quite simple in the format, but again, it's really what I would like to suggest is do not skip fields. It's just human nature to try to get done with something real quick, and I'm done. Okay, now what's the magic answer? But if some of these questions challenge you, make sure you fill them out, because that's probably where some of the interesting outcomes are going to be for you. So, starting at the top, obviously the farm owner. Real important to understand your description of the land that you've got available. Is it tillable? Is it pasture? Is it woodlot? Is it buildings? Or it's other, maybe wetlands? to understand what may be the best use of that land. Is it well drained? Is it not well drained? What kind of livestock enterprises do you have? Could you, in some cases, stack some of those enterprises and may not be looking at that at the moment? Understand your crop enterprises. Are those crops complementary to each other? Are there other things that we can do in the crop area that may be, organic feed wise or non-GMO that may bring you a higher return should you consider planting in other crops? Cover crops are really a big topic these days. So maybe the concern as well, right now I do regular tillage, but by getting someone to adopt a no-till practice and then potentially cover crops, you can address maybe, again, indirectly some organic matter needs, some nutrient needs, and maybe even cost needs. If a farmer knows, I'm really struggling here to make a living, if you can somehow, through this analysis, help them reduce the inputs, increase the yields, you may be better off. So I'm going to keep going. Is everybody hearing me okay? Okay, I saw a sign there having experiences with audio challenges. Getting on to weed control, is there a natural issue there? Using a lot of pesticides, because again, weed control, you think, oh, I need to control the weeds. You apply pesticides, there are a lot of negative outcomes for that pesticide application. Page 2, again, I touched on cover crops already. Really an interesting subject that's bringing a lot of folks back into producing an extra crop. Maybe not just corn, but if you get corn silage off early, get a cover crop, you can actually harvest or graze that cover crop in the spring. So interesting ideas there. And then lastly, again, when we start the summary, the priority goals of that landowner, always try to summarize those quite well and always come back to those and make sure we're working on helping them achieve those goals. So that's the format. Again, not overly complex, but again, try not to skip any of those fields if possible, because they're all important, and I'll go on to some other examples of why that is. So again, why use a whole farm plan? Clarifying your own goals and understanding your true goals will help you with a path to actually achieve them. Understanding what type of ag operation your assets best support. Maybe your land, if with the slope, maybe it's better for grazing than row crops. Maybe because of your buildings and infrastructure, you may help to diversify the species of animals and do chickens and other things. And again, just completing the process gives you a much higher chance of success. You can quickly scan it and see, do we have fertility issues? Do we have soil loss issues, erosion issues, or maybe just some simpler things like profitability and bottom lines. And almost in every case where we've done these assessments, there's a eureka moment where people say, wow, I didn't think of that. I didn't realize that, and I'll give you some examples. So again, the exercise is very valuable. So I wanted to give some examples of real life rather than just run on, and each one of you are going to have your own key points, but and these are areas where we've really helped some situations improve. An absentee landowner. The land is maybe very important from them, maybe third, fourth generation, but they're not there every day. They kind of want to know, how is my organic matter? How is my farm being treated? How is the soil being treated? Is it healthy? And then they may want to know what practices, i.e. cover crops or other things that they can challenge their renter with, but in a fair way, and say, hey, I'd like you to use these practices. How can we incorporate these practices to improve the quality of our farm? We had a dairy producer, obviously was struggling, working extremely hard, had a great herd, but he knew he was struggling with profitability. Not a surprise with milk prices being the same as they were 20, 25 years ago. In our assessment, and again, third party looking around, saw a nice chunk of woods, asked, what do you do in the woods? He said, oh, it's worthless. We've logged it 10 years ago. There's no logs in it. But it was about 60 acres. And we said, have you considered leasing that to hunting? Well, who would lease that? Hunting leases are extremely, extremely popular today. They go on average in our county for about $30 an acre. So, that's not a ton of money, but if you've got really good hunting, you're looking at thousands of dollars a year. The guy didn't hunt; he was too busy to hunt, and he ended up getting $2,000 to $3,000 a year for this plot of land simply by letting somebody hunt it, and that was $3,000 straight to the bottom line. So again, understanding all the assets you've got available. Row crop farmer wanting to know how to increase yields and reduce their costs, cover crops are a great way to do that. And then understanding how to actually implement those cover crops. And then lastly, obviously, there's lots of recreational landowners. Just buy a piece of land in the country. Letting land be idle is not a good management tool. It's going to quickly be overgrown with invasives, and maybe having some cattle, some contract grazing, and maybe planting certain species or getting rid of certain species will help bird habitat if that may be an interest to them. So some really good examples of where this exercise, and it doesn't take forever to do, can really help you achieve your goals depending on what you want to do. So who can help you? Who can do this farm plans? A lot of different folks out there. If you do online search, there's a lot of extension folks. North Carolina has got a program that helps people out, so that's a cooperative extension model. Holistic Management Institute is one of the first ones that pops up online, and again, Savory Institute does have hubs in the U.S. Where they're also available to help with these things for a fee. I'd suggest to start with by doing it yourself. If you're fair and you take time and maybe do it with a partner or a friend or a family member so that you challenge each other to really get answers to each of these questions. And if there's answers you don't know, like what is my organic matter, what are my fertility levels, you probably need to know that. And then just by getting those answers, it's going to help you progress. If you are in Southwest Wisconsin, our man Ted Bay may be available to help you out, so feel free to contact the Pasture Project. We don't travel that extensively, so if you're outside the Southwest Wisconsin area, we can't help you. But again, lastly, a ton of internet resources, courses, and even things like this webinar to kind of put your foot in the water and understand how things work. So. We will take questions later, but I did want to flash this up in the middle here for a bit and share my contact information with you and a beautiful picture of our cattle grazing our sorghum sudan grass, which is another resource, and planting an annual in a hayfield, which is another great idea and very cheap. So ending with a good example, and I guess, Pete, then I will hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Rod, for that overview of whole farm planning, and I'll leave that up there just for a moment there with your contact information so that folks can write that down before we switch things over to our next presenter. So with that, we'll go ahead and switch on to our next presenter, John Zinn, who's going to walk us through and share some more information around grazing plans and how grazing fits into whole farm planning.
I'm going to speak about grazing systems as a component of whole farm planning. So the advantages of grazing systems are numerous. Animals harvest their own forages, which reduces feed cost, and feed cost is the #1 expense for livestock operations. The infrastructure, once it's installed, lasts for a long time. 20 years is pretty typical for fences and 10 years for watering systems. Producers report better herd health for animals that are out on pasture, which makes sense. It's a cleaner environment. And there's multiple environmental benefits. We have reduced soil erosion, better soil health, and cleaner water. And then also for producers, they report that their lifestyle improves. I think being able to have the animals go to work for you, harvesting the feed and spreading the manure, is a much better alternative for many people. So the planning steps that we typically follow, and this is based off the model that the Natural Resources Conservation Service uses, modified a little bit. #1, dovetailing into what Rod was talking about, is to determine your objectives and goals. And then once you've done that, the planning process begins with taking inventory of the resources that you have available to you, evaluating those. And then once you've done that, you can start developing alternatives. And among those alternatives, then you can select a plan. And then once the plan's selected, you'll implement that plan over a period of years. Oftentimes, particularly with a grazing system that requires the installation of many feet of fence and typically a pipeline watering system, and maybe if cropland conversions in the plans converting that by doing a seeding. So then eventually, once all those different pieces are installed, you'll evaluate how the plan is meeting the original objectives. And you may need to adjust your plan. It simply may be, for example, that you were overly optimistic and maybe you can't carry as much livestock as you thought, or maybe you can carry more livestock than what you thought. And oftentimes we might find that it's good to reevaluate the original objectives. So those are the planning steps, and we'll go through those individually. Talking a little bit about objectives, when I interview producers, one of the key objectives really is making a profit. You know, if you can't make a profit, the rest of it is not sustainable. So one of the items that we often discuss is, can I increase my stocking rate? And that's usually something that they want to do. So in order to do that, we have to be able to manage our forages so that they're more productive. But we have to be able to project whether we can balance our available forage with the animal demand. So let's talk a little bit about the resource inventory, the first step in the planning process. The key components of the resource inventory, first and foremost, is the soils, because the soils will tell us what the productive capability is of the entire farm and what the competing and alternative uses would be for that farm. The second item would be the existing forages. What's out there now? Are they adapted for the livestock? Are they the most productive forages that we could have on the farm? Will they meet the production needs of the animals? Livestock water is very important. Without clean, fresh water, we don't get good animal performance. Do we have natural sources of water? Do we have an adequate well if we want to install a pipeline? And is it feasible to use a pipeline to get water to the livestock? Doing a livestock inventory, we might consider the kind and class of livestock that's on the farm, and perhaps the number that's there now, and then the future number. Maybe the producer wants to expand their herd to improve profitability and anticipate being able to expand their herd through intensive grazing management. And then another consideration would be identifying sensitive features, such as the stream that we see in this picture. Surface water features such as streams, ponds, and lakes, droughty areas, prairie remnants. So with good grazing management, we can successfully use a sensitive feature just by limiting the amount of time that animals have access to it. And then the overall management knowledge and ability of the producer, whether they're willing to make the changes that's needed to implement a grazing system, and the amount of knowledge that they need to acquire to implement it. So we have a publicly available source of soils information that's called Web Soil Survey. And the link is on this slide, but also I have given the Pasture Project a listing of these links so that you could write it down now, but it will be available with the information that you're going to get today. So once you open Web Soil Survey, you'll see a green Start button. And when you push that button, you're going to see that there are search methods that are available to you. And what's been working quite well now is, if you look over on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that the address tab there, that has worked pretty well. But you can also use state and county. If you have the soil survey area, you can use that. And if you have latitude and longitude, that search is available to you. But assuming that you can use the address button, the next thing you'll do is identify an area of interest, and you'll see over under that this area of interest has been identified, and we've pulled up the soil map for this parcel. And it will give you the soil survey map unit, the percentage that are in the parcel of each soil survey map unit, and it'll give you further soils information, including one that's very useful in planning a grazing system, which is the Forage Suitability group. So that would be listed under the ecological site ID portion over on the left side of the page. And you'll see you get a color-coded map. And in addition to that, it will list the soil map units and give you a Forage Suitability group rating. So if you look under those ratings columns, you will see that there is a system of identifying them. G105 stands for the driftless region of southwest Wisconsin, northeast Illinois, and southeastern Minnesota. And so that soil rating will be, that's soil Forage Suitability group number 8. You'll see that on this particular tract, there's quite a lot of 8 and 6. So if we wanted to get an idea of what the capability of that Forage Suitability group was, we could use another public source of information, which is the Field Office Technical Guide. And we can access that either by searching for EFOTG or using this web link that's on the screen. And this is also part of the packet that you'll be receiving. So once you do that, you will get a locator, and you simply click on the state, and then typically when you get to the state, they will ask you for a county. You'll click on the county, and the information for the Forage Suitability groups are located in section 2 of the Field Office Technical Guide. So there'll be a drop down on the left side there. And maybe you can see my cursor on the screen there. So there's the drop down for that. And you'll pull out Forage Suitability groups. Once you click on Forage Suitability groups, you can grab the Forage Suitability group that applies to your tract of land. And I've pulled up this Forage Suitability Group 6. And this is for Wisconsin. Each state has their own Forage Suitability groups with a description, and the format is quite similar. You'll get an adapted species list with annual species, legumes, cool season grasses, warm season grasses. And then you'll also, there's 8 pages of information, and it's quite comprehensive. You'll also get, and this is really important in planning a grazing system, you'll also get yields of typical forages under low management and high management. And we use those yields to determine the grazing productive capacity of an individual farm that we're planning on. The next step in the resource inventory is going to be identifying the existing forages. So the topic of plant identification is a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation. There's a lot of material here that we're covering pretty rapidly. But once you get those forages identified, and typically they're going to be introduced cool season grasses and legumes in the eastern United States. Our major grasses that we tend to see on existing pastures are Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, the fescues, timothy, and the brome grasses. And then we'll see red and white clover, alfalfa, sometimes some bird's foot trefoil, and occasionally some of the vetches. And these species respond well to being managed to maintain a 4-inch residual growth. That's because they have to have enough leaf area to maintain an adequate solar collector, if you will, to be able to regrow rapidly. And also, by maintaining a 4-inch residual, we maintain the growing points of these plants so they don't have to restart from tillers. If we get on a typically heavy use pasture that's been grazed continuously, we'll see a pattern of vegetation emerge, and that is usually Kentucky bluegrass, weeds, thistles, unpalatable species. And most of our existing pastures are not managed as intensively as the surrounding cropland, so they may or may not have any soil tests taken on them, and they may or may not need corrections of the macronutrients and lime. But one of the ways that we can improve all of our pastures is to manage them like a crop that we're harvesting predominantly with livestock, but we may also harvest some hay from our pastures, particularly as our growth patterns, most of the cool season forages tend to put on most of their growth earlier in the season when the temperatures are cooler. So here's an example of a really dense stand of forages. You can see that there's at least 2 species of legumes in there. There's some red clover, there's some bird's foot trefoil, and there's at least 3 species of grass in there. So diversity tends to buffer the pasture sward and makes it a lot more productive and a lot more resilient to different changes in weather. As part of our resource inventory, we want to determine also the forage quality. We want to look at what our current production is, but also we want to look and plan for the potential amount. And then if we have high performance animals such as dairy cows or even dairy goats or dairy sheep, or we're trying to grass finish beef, we have to have adequate quality of feed. And then also we need to monitor invasive weeds, because if we do have a really serious weed problem, we might have to take care of that before we do anything else. Typically, the broadleaf weeds are, if we're going to go the herbicide route, the same herbicides that kill the broadleaf weeds also take out the legumes. So we can use a couple of different methods of determining how much feed our pasture is going to produce. We can use book values, which are the yields from the forage suitability groups, or we can take a more time-consuming but more accurate method of clipping and weighing. For most planning purposes, we're going to use the book values. That gets us close enough, and we're able to use that for determining the paddock size and for determining the size based on the number of days that the animals are going to be occupying that paddock. The concept of forage density is worth mentioning because it can change over time with good management. And by good management, I mean the ability to put livestock in a given area, defoliate it, and then rest it till it recuperates. This forage density is measured in pounds of dry matter per acre per inch. So imagine cutting an inch off an entire acre. That's the measurement we're trying to get at. If we get a higher ground cover, this usually means that we have greater stand density. And we can correlate high ground cover to different levels of forage density. If we have more than 90% ground cover, this usually means that we've got more than 250 pounds of dry matter per inch per acre. However, if we look at a typical pasture, that hasn't been under a grazing management system for a long time, we're going to see more like 200 pounds of dry matter per acre per inch. So in determining paddock size and determining how much to offer animals, we can use these thumb rules. This is the Wisconsin model from their forage suitability groups. So moving from left to right, if we had a real high hay yield of about 4.5 tons per acre, that would mean that we would have about 1,800 pounds of dry matter available for grazing per rotation. So you can see, looking as you move toward the right, that number that's available decreases with the decreasing hay yield. But thumb rules do have some limitations. Forage density can vary with weather conditions. As it gets drier and with cool season pastures, as it gets warmer, the plants tend to produce fewer leaves. So we can have less forage density, and we can actually have to adjust our paddock size and make them larger to adjust to the weather conditions. So this is just a starting point for planning purposes. We also observe that with all kinds of plants, they tend to have what's called a typical growth curve. They will produce more forage at times of the year when their needs are better met. Our cool season grass pastures and legume pastures will actually produce a majority of their feed in May and June, which is usually the time when our weather conditions match what they need in terms of ideal growing conditions. But we can sometimes have enough feed produced throughout the growing season, but actually fall short during those times when the plants may go dormant. Typically for cool seasons, that would be in July and August when the temperatures get above their ideal growing temperature. The next part of our resource inventory are the livestock. We'll want to find out the existing number of each kind and class of livestock and the planned number, because that's often a factor in planning. We might have a certain number right now, but we want to have more in the future. We want to look at their average weight, because that tells us a lot about what they're going to consume, both in water and in feed. And then we're going to determine the overall livestock forage demand and water demand. So here's the formula section of our presentation. We can use these to get us pretty close to how much feed to offer. So if we take the body weight of a livestock group and multiply it by 4%, we can tell how much dry matter we should offer to them on a daily basis. And for those of you who've done feed calculations for stored feed, you'll notice this is a little bit more than the typical 2.5% to 3% that you might use. We build in a factor for some waste and trampling. For 50 beef cows that weigh 1,200 pounds each, that equates to a 60,000 pound group weight. And if we multiply our 60,000 pound group by that decimal equivalent of 4%, we estimate that this group is going to need 2,400 pounds of dry matter per day offered to them. So looking at our forage availability, if we assume from our table that we have a 3 ton per acre hay yield, that means that we'll use a forage availability for each rotation of 1,200 pounds per acre every time we turn them out onto that pasture. So for our group of beef cattle with a daily consumption of 2,400 pounds per day, we estimate the paddock size for one day to be about 2 acres. Of course, that's going to vary with the weather conditions, and we have to be willing and able to make observations and adjust on the fly as we make those observations. But for planning purposes, we would assume that. In order to keep the animals from regrazing the regrowth, we're using a 7-day maximum occupancy period. So for that group of cattle, if we wanted a 7-day paddock, that would mean we would have about a 14 or 15 acre paddock, assuming uniform growth in that paddock. If we go shorter than that, we can get a lot better utilization, and we get a lot better nutrient distribution as well, particularly if we've got water placed such that the animals don't have to travel too far to get to it. We can also use a larger paddock and subdivide it with temporary fence, such as polywire, where we can be flexible based on our labor requirements. There might be some times of the year where we can change that polywire every day. For dairy producers, they might want to change that every 12 hours. Get a lot better utilization, a lot better nutrient distribution that way. But there might be times when it's just not practical or feasible to do that. So we can make our plan such that it is flexible, starting with larger permanent paddocks, but subdividing with temporary fencing. So here's an example from a grazing plan of what is often the keystone of that plan, and that's the forage balance. On the top, if you can see that we estimate the demand for a beef cow-calf herd that calves in the spring. And all the forage requirements are listed in thousands of pounds of forage. Early in the season in May, we just have the cows. We may have some young calves in there, but at that point, they're not eating much forage. But if it's a spring calving herd, by the time they get into July, the calves have some size on them, and they're now consuming a much larger part of their diet as forage. And as they increase in body size, they will continue to consume more forage. And in September, they've achieved, and now we've increased our total forage consumption by about 1/3. Now, looking down the page at the forage supply side, you'll see that we have a number of paddocks, and some of them have different capability for dry matter production. Paddock 1 is capable of only 2,500 pounds per acre. And the reason that is on this particular farm is this is a soil that's very shallow to bedrock, maybe just a foot of soil over bedrock. And it's a south-facing slope, so it gets a lot of heat. It dries out. The growth curve is going to be the same. It's still going to produce most of the forage early in the season, but it's not going to produce as much as these other paddocks, which are converted cropland that can do twice, maybe 2.5 times as much. So we take all the estimates of forage production by month. We sum those up in the summary down at the bottom. And then we compare the forage demand. And we can see that although we have enough forage in 1 month, we're going to be deficient in the rest of the growing season. So that's going to mean we're either going to have to adjust our plan to destock cattle, or we're going to have to reduce the overall number for the growing season, or we might decide that we're going to pull these animals into a sacrifice paddock and feed them stored feed until the forage recovers to the extent that we can graze them again. This livestock forage balance sheet can tell us that. And if things don't work on paper, they may not work in practice. Water, a very important element of grazing system, essential for life. We have 2 existing sources of water from the surface or from a well. But we do know this, that it's very hard to maintain surface water sources, particularly ponds, especially as the season progresses. We get our best livestock performance when it's clean, fresh, and easily accessed. And water location really influences grazing efficiency. You can see this in a number of pastures where the livestock have to travel a long distance to water. You'll see, if it's a really long distance, you'll see that the forage is often untouched at the far end of the pasture and that there's very heavy use near the water source. And you'll often see livestock trails that have been worn in the pasture leading to the water source, sometimes with pretty significant erosion. So here's an example of one of those. You can see this trail that's been worn down to the stream, and I've seen even worse examples than this when the stream banks are really steep. So this might be something where we could, by subdividing the pasture and putting some alternative water sources, we could not only reduce the erosion, but we could really improve the water quality and really improve the efficiency of grazing. Here's a typical water tank, and you'll notice there's a pipeline that's on the surface of the ground that fills this tank. And these tanks they've got a full flow valve in them. We like to get the tanks located so that the livestock can all see each other, and that when they're in a given paddock, and that'll allow them to come up as single animals or cow-calf pairs or a couple of cow-calf pairs. That really helps our grazing distribution and allows us to have a little bit smaller tank profile than when we have to supply an entire group of animals. So how much water do we figure on when we're doing a grazing system plan? Minnesota and Wisconsin use 2 gallons per 100 pounds of body weight. So for our group of 50 beef cows with that 60,000 pounds of body weight, that means we have to deliver 1,200 gallons per day. What we're seeing here in this picture is a farm that's got 150 beef cows, and that's a 600-gallon tank. So there you're looking at, 3,600 gallons a day. So the fences become a really important part of the plan. We identify the existing fences on our map. We typically, when we go out to a place, we'll take an aerial photo with us to sketch in the fences and the location of watering sources and cattle working facilities. Then we'll sketch out our planned locations, and usually it takes a couple different versions of the plan before we can come up with a final version. As a planner, I'm walking onto the farm cold, and the farmer will know some things definitely that I won't know. And it's a collaborative process. We get our heads together and we'll compare notes. It might take 1, might take 2, might take 3 different visits to get it done. And I might see some things that they don't see. But sometimes we found it's good to experiment with temporary fence before building a fixed layout. So there's just some things that the livestock will tell you that you don't think of. And we want to make sure, as we said, to keep our paddock size down to a 7-day occupancy period. We've got several different fence types, the most common being high tensile electric fence. It's sturdy, it's fast to build, it's partially a barrier fence. It can take a tree branch falling on it without breaking. It can take a deer running through it without breaking. But there's still a number of producers that want to use barbed wire because they don't want the maintenance of electric fences. And for small animals like sheep and goats, woven wire might be appropriate, simply not only to keep them in, but to keep predators out. And then subdivision fences for electric fence are either poly wire or the net fence for sheep and goats. So here's an example of a multi-strand barbed wire fence. You'll notice it's double braced. And you often, if you get much more than about 5 strands of barbed wire or high tensile wire, you may need a double brace like that, particularly if you have sandy soil conditions. Here's an example of high tensile electric fence with what's known as a floating brace. You'll notice that the diagonal brace rests on a rock pad, and there's a brace wire that runs horizontally along the ground there. This is the most common type of fence that we've been building with NRCS financial assistance contracts. This is another style of post for high tensile electric. It's fiberglass. It's self-insulating, pretty tough and durable. It's got a 20-year guarantee with the manufacturer. And then for small animal producers, woven wire fence. Although this particular example, they built an awful lot of woven wire fence. They had 300 sheep in western Minnesota. Sometimes, usually with dairy operations, you'll need to construct a livestock travel lane. This is in northern Minnesota. We've got a lot of low, swampy ground, and they had to build an elevated lane with a hard rock surface on it. They're fairly spendy to build, but you really run into some problems getting animals to and from a grazing system. You get mud holes, and you can have increases in mastitis. So you may not have to rock the entire lane, but you may have to rock some areas that are susceptible to erosion or susceptible to having water coming in on them. Other considerations when drawing up this grazing plan are sacrifice areas. You know, there may be times when it's just too wet to have the animals out on the paddock. They'll just tear it up, or you might run into a prolonged drought where you've eaten your forages down to the residual stubble height you want to maintain, and you just have to put them up and feed them for a while. Water system contingency planning. You know, the power can go out if you have a pipeline. Ponds can dry up. So having a plan to deal with that is important. The location and kind of livestock handling facilities that you have. You know, there's times you get sick animals. You want to plan it so that you have an easy way of getting livestock to a facility where you can treat them. You might want to use annual forages. Rod showed us that picture of his animals eating sorghum sudan grass. That's a great forage for filling in that summer slump. Really productive, really palatable, very nutritious. And then weed control can be a problem, particularly for organic producers. So developing some strategies to deal with that on the front end. Our fence and water layout, we want to try to keep paddocks with similar soils and similar productive capabilities together, hence the forage suitability groups. And if possible, we'll try to keep a paddock with the same slope aspect. So from increasing solar radiation, north is our least solar radiation, and then east, west, and south being our highest solar radiation. So if we do have a paddock, we try to keep all that together. If we have a livestock pipeline, we want to keep our water high on the landscape. We found that if we keep it low, the animals tend to congregate down there, and it really kills our grazing efficiency. We'll finally get a plan map that looks something like this. You'll notice that we've got a name for each paddock. We've got fences marked. We've got acres. And when we're keeping records of the animals moving through the system, it's really handy to have a name to put on things. So particularly in the beginning phases of setting up a managed grazing system, so we get a feel for how the animals flow through that system. In terms of cost, our most expensive fence is going to be woven wire, followed by barbed wire, followed by high tensile electric, and then the cheapest being the common electric fence. For our watering systems, deep buried systems are the most expensive, and surface pipelines are the least expensive. In terms of cost, for a woven wire fence, you may be looking at $5 to $7 per foot. High tensile electric fence, depending on the wires, your bracing is always your most expensive part of any fence, but you may be looking at, for a high tensile electric, $1.50 to $2 a foot for your multi-wire high tensile electric fence. If it's built right, it can last a long time. 20, 30 years isn't uncommon. Your pipelines can last usually 10 years. Usually the pipeline itself lasts longer than the components, the floats in the tanks. They tend to go bad. Your heavy use area protection for tank pads is fairly expensive, $4 or $5 a square foot. And your livestock travel lanes, a 10-foot wide livestock travel lane armored with gravel will also cost you about $4 a lineal foot. So they're not cheap. However, we do have some other practices, planting new forage and converting cropland. You're looking at a cost $150 to $250 more if you're going to go with the native species. Your system cost depends on a lot of factors. Typically, your small animal systems are more expensive because you're dealing with a lot more expensive type of fence. So there is funding assistance through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, in particular the Environmental Quality Assistance Program. It pays a flat rate for different conservation practice scenarios. So to give you an example, fence is paid so many dollars a foot, pipeline is paid so many dollars a foot, livestock travel lanes so much a foot, and pasture seeding so much an acre. It's a competitive process. In order to compete and be ranked, you need to have a plan that meets NRCS specs. And if you are accepted, you sign a penalty with NRCS that has possible penalties for non-completion. But once you get all your infrastructure, your fences, your watering system done, there is an incentive payment that's available that for intensive grazing, about $59 per acre, and that's for successfully completing the grazing management, maintaining the appropriate residual stubble height. And for the less intense, it's around $20 an acre. So you can get the current payment rates for Minnesota and Wisconsin from this link, and that's also listed in the handout that you're going to receive from the Pasture Project. Here's an example from that cookbook, and you'll notice option A is a multi-strand barbed wire or smooth wire fence. That's the unit is in feet. They have a maximum payment limitation of $50,000. The payment rate is $1.23 a foot. And then if you're what's classified as a historically underserved producer, that would be a minority woman, other groups, that's a little bit higher payment rate. So managing the grazing system, grazing records are important. It's important to give the paddocks a name or a number. Tell when the animals went in, what the forage height was when you went in, when did the animals go out, and what was the forage height. Those records would be records that you would submit as your grazing management records to receive your incentive payment, but they're useful to do whether you're involved in government programs or not, particularly when you get started in a grazing system, to give you a feel for managing it. Other observations, which forages are getting eaten, are the animals getting filled up? And then looking ahead is important. Do I have enough reserve on hand? Pasture sticks can be used to measure our forage height. We look at the height of the leaf blades. And a pasture condition score sheet is a good long-term tool. I won't go through the different parameters here, but your handout has a link to that. If you're interested, you can get in or do a web search on pasture condition score sheet. That'll get you there. We mentioned grazing annual forages as a way to increase your forage supply and get through the summer slump. You can also graze cover crops. This is from the Manuka Experiment Station in North Dakota, and this was grazed by some beef cattle. You can also stockpile forage for later use, and it's a picture of some animals grazing in early December this year. So that really is a way of making your stored feed go better. There's also the opportunity, if you're a row crop farmer, or you, as a row crop farmer, you could rent your land out to somebody to graze corn stalks or other crop residue. There's a lot of advantages to that. Bale grazing is a way of adding fertility to existing pastures or crop fields. You set your bales out and protect them with electric wire from being grazed, and just move the bale rings. So to recap, consider all the resources that you have available. Manage your forage and livestock balance. That's the most important part of it. It takes constant observation and adjusting to conditions. Grazing management of your perennial forages, annual forages, cover crops, and crop residues can really reduce your feed costs and increase your farm profit potential. So I think I have a little bit of time here. I'm going to show you a couple of parts of an actual grazing plan here. This is Wisconsin Job Sheet 528, the prescribed grazing plan. So you'll notice it's a format for doing the grazing plan. It's got your resource inventory, soils, forage inventory, tells where we got our production estimates, tells what we think some pasture improvements might be, goes into the forage animal balance, and spells out the grazing plan. And I'll pull up another one here. Here's a seeding plan, and it lists the different species. This one tells how many pounds per acre in pure live seed we should put in, and gives us a coverage of number of seeds per square foot. So in this plan, we have a mixture of meadow fescue, festilolium, grazing alfalfa, orchard grass, red clover, and white clover. So we've got a real diverse mix in there. So with that, I think we can open it up to questions now.
Great. Thanks for that, John. It was helpful. You gave us a lot of information there, and we will switch over to some questions here. So we do have one here right off the bat that I will read through. It's a little bit of a lengthy one, and John, I think this one might be for you. So the question is, the rule of thumb for forage availability grazing references pounds per acre per rotation of 4.5 tons, which seems to indicate 5 rotations per growing season, or a set of 35-day grazing rotation schedule. Would that total yield of the production system be increased with adaptive grazing, or would the increase in the quality from adaptive grazing decrease the dry matter intake needed per head, thus making up the difference in production yields? So it's kind of a long question. John, hopefully you got all that one.
Okay, well, the first part, I showed that one as an example of just to show the concept. You might pick different levels of production depending on your forage suitability group. So I think what they're asking is, does your forage, improve over time? And do you get better quality and quantity as you adopt the grazing management system? And the answer to that, based on people that have been doing it a long time, is yes. Typically, as they practice grazing management and they leave adequate stubble height, and they do soil testing and fertilize their pastures, and they add desirable species, they do improve their forage yield and they improve their forage quality, so that it results in their ability to carry more livestock on a given piece of ground. The hard part is, for some people, is accepting that that process takes time, and all the while, the forage plants, as they get managed intensively, they develop a deeper and stronger root system, and the soil organic matter and soil structure improves such that the infiltration rates and the available water holding capacity increase. So you have, it's kind of a layered effect. You're getting your soil resources is improving your forage, and your forage is improving your soil resource to result in higher overall productivity. I hope I'm answering that, what they wanted.
Yeah, I think that was great, John. Thanks for that. Another question that's come in, Rod, this could be maybe one that you could take on. Someone was asking about the frequency that that whole farm plans, or that template that you shared. What's recommended? Is that something that happens on an annual basis, every 5 years? And also, kind of going along with that, there was another question about what, from your experience, what is kind of maybe the most difficult part of that for a farmer or a grazer to be honest about, to kind of paraphrase what someone's question was.
Yeah, great. Excellent question. So we highly recommend, if you've never done one, to do one immediately, and then probably sense check it every year. Say it every year. Maybe you want to look at it more often than that, but things just simply take time to change. Your organic matter is not going to change overnight. Your growing season, here a season goes by fast. So I would say I recommend it every year. And you maybe want to pull in a third party or a professional like every 5 years. Just make sure you're being honest, you're on track. Have them sense check your records. And I think if you go to that work to be that diligent, you'll see great results. What was the second part of that, Pete?
A question about some of the more challenging part of that assessment. If you're doing it yourself, where it might be the harder to maybe be hard on yourself, I guess.
It's probably more people get in a rush, and the ones that we see is people, you ask them to fill it out, because that's part of the exercise, to be honest with yourself, and they usually fill it out halfway, meaning a lot of stuff is blank. And they'll say, our farm's 400 acres. They want to break down the types of acres. They don't do soil tests. They don't know what their nutrition levels are. And it's those critical things that if you don't know, it's like driving with a blindfold on. And so I think it's to understand, you need to know these things, and here's why. And to get folks, and they'll start nodding, and it's just to go through. You really need to understand those things. And also, probably the next biggest thing, oftentimes when people say, well, we're not making enough money, Pete, we may take them through a number of the calculators we have. They won't be honest with themselves about true cost. It's a classic farmer mistake, young and old, to say, well, my time is free. My time is my cost. So they'll deny the true cost of inputs. I don't know why, because their time isn't free. But I guess that would be my main comments.
Great. Thanks, Rod. John, here's a question for you. At what height should we measure grasses when trying to calculate forage availability?
Yeah, you want to look at the level of the leaf blades. So if you've got a pasture that's headed out like some of them are right now, you don't want to look at the head height. You want to look at the leaf blade height, where the leaf blades are laying over now.
Great.
Good question.
Definitely. And it looks like we have one more question here that we can get to, and then we'll start to wrap up. There was a question about specifically, and again, this is a question maybe for you, John, around certified grazing plans versus informal grazing plans. And are there other ways to go about it other than using the template that you showed, the NRCS template? Can grazing plans be done informally?
Well, they sure can be, and I would suggest to somebody, and I was going to mention this, but I'm glad that I got this question. There's a really good publication out there called the Grazing Systems Planning Guide, and there's a Wisconsin version of it and a Minnesota version of it. And the link to that is on that handout, and it'll tell you step by step how you can do it. You know, you don't have to fill out all those forms. It'll use the same math formulas, maybe slightly different, because you do have to figure out what the carrying capacity of your place is, you know, to be able to graze sustainably. But I'd recommend that as an informal way of doing it.
Great. Thank you, John. So we'll wrap up questions for now. Thanks to all those who submitted questions, and thanks to Rod and John for responding to those. We'll just make a few more comments here before we wrap up the webinar for the evening. So really quickly, just a couple reminders here for those of you that are with us. Make sure that you register for some the upcoming Pasture Project webinars that are happening in July. We went through those at the top of the webinar. Again, those are going to be covering a lot of great information, and they're going to feature some of the best experts in the field that are doing this work with farmers and grazers throughout the upper Midwest. So make sure you check that out on the pastureproject.org /events website, and you can go ahead and register for those now. Also, just to make a quick note that there are those handouts that are available in the control panel of GoToWebinar. So make sure you click that and download those. As was mentioned, Rod has shared the whole farm planning assessment form that he shared as a PDF that you can fill out and use and save for yourself. And then John also provided the links to all the various different resources and websites that he suggested. And finally, there is a summary of the Pasture Project that is in there as well. So that's something that you can read if you'd like a little bit more information about some of the specific projects that we're working on right now. The other thing that I would mention, just really briefly again, is the post-webinar survey. Like I mentioned, it's quick and confidential, and it really helps us to offer more free webinars coming up in the future. And we will have more of those in July, August, and then into September. And we'll try to keep those coming as much as possible. So when you do close out, that will pop up on your screen, and you just click through and provide the answers. And that, again, is confidential just to the Pasture Project team, and we don't ever share personal information. So with that, we will wrap up for this evening. So thank you for tuning in. I want to leave you with some contact information here. Of course, as I mentioned, I'm Pete, Program Officer of the Pasture Project. You're more than welcome to reach out to me via email. There's also Rod, his email there. More than happy to connect with him about not only whole farm work, but also some of the other things that are happening in the Kickapoo River watershed in southwest Wisconsin. And then you can get in touch with John if you have any questions around some of the grazing plan components that he walked through, or any specific information about the resources that were shared. So feel free to follow up. I'm more than happy to provide information. But with that, we'll wrap up the webinar for the evening. So I want to say thank you again for joining us tonight, and we hope that we will see you again on a future Pasture Project webinar.